Well, good evening, afternoon, morning, whatever it might be, wherever you are as you read this or as you watch this video. I wanted to take a few minutes tonight and talk a little bit about Paul's letters, since that's part of the topic for this week's learning. In your readings, we'll talk more about the later letters of Paul, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But first, I just wanted to mostly say a few general words about letter writing in the ancient world. Um, now, most of us don't really write letters very much anymore. I used to years ago, but I rarely write a letter, maybe once a year, to some people that I know in another country. Um, Now, if I asked you, each of you to raise your hand and to raise your hand if you'd written a letter in the last year, I'm guessing, uh, maybe some of you had, but probably most of you have not written a letter. Certainly not in the last couple of months. Probably not in the last year. Although those of you in the military, you probably actually do more letter writing than most of the rest of us do, since that's um, one way to communicate with people when you're stationed abroad, or stationed apart. Um, Although I'm guessing there's other ways still to communicate by email and such. Um, when I spent a year abroad, I spent a year in France in high school. I actually did a lot of the letter writing with family and friends back home. But when I came home and I went to college and I started using email, I hardly ever wrote a letter after that. Um, in fact, I would say that probably none of you go probably even more than a day without writing at least one email or one message on Facebook or a message on Instagram or whatever social media you might use, if you do. Um, well, I would actually say that letter writing in the ancient world was in many ways very similar to the emails that we write to each other today. They're usually short, um, usually to the point, communicating some brief bit of news, and maybe not incredibly formal, although there's certain structures that we follow, right? You usually put the person's name, you usually put your name at the end, though maybe not always, since your name is in the email. Um, and you know who you're receiving the email from by the email address. Well, archaeological digs have actually discovered thousands upon thousands of these letters that were written in the ancient world. Just regular letters, not necessarily written by Christians or any particular group. Just thousands of letters were written by everyday people, and most of them were short. Most of them communicated brief bits of information. Asking news of a brother or sister, requesting your daughter to come visit you, these types of things. And in fact, these letters were often so informal that sometimes they would take a broken bit of pottery that they might have had sitting around them, and they would write the brief little note on the broken bit of pottery, and then send that along with the messenger. But most letters actually were written on what's called papyrus. Papyrus was the type of paper that was used before what we call parchment, which is basically the paper we use today. And it actually was made from this plant called the papyrus plant, which grows heavily in Egypt, primarily in Egypt, and it grows in along riverbeds and basically where there's a lot of water, they'll grow. But you take these strips off the plant and you'd lay them down, and then you'd lay other strips across, and you kind of press them together, and this would make papyrus paper. And that's what the vast majority of people wrote on. And these letters that have been discovered were written on these papyrus, or papyri would be the plural form of that. Anyways, one of the things that sometimes we don't think about is that in a pre-digital age, somebody had to carry the letters by hand. Right? We still have the post office. We still have letters and invitations and cards that are sent through the mail, right? And those has to be carried by a letter carrier. But it's very organized in our world today, right? You've got the post office, you've got UPS, you've got FedEx, you've got all these services that carry these things. But in the ancient world, even though there were some of those services, there were messenger services, people that could hire themselves out to carry a message to somebody. The vast majority of the time, you would send your letter along with either a relative or a friend, or it might be a friend of a friend, but somebody that you knew you could trust to carry this message. And you think about it, especially if it was an important letter, you had to make sure that you really trusted this person that carried the letter to your brother or sister, your father, your mother. You wanted to be sure that it got there. It's much like today when you might send a letter with confirmation. If you want confirmation on the letter, you can pay a little extra to have tracking and that type of thing. But in the ancient world, the only way you could be sure that your letter got delivered was by sending it along with a messenger who was somebody you could trust, right? If it was somebody you could trust, then you knew it was going to get there. So that shows you the importance of relationships and having relationships of trust with other people. Because without those relationships of trust, you didn't know if your letter was going to make it to the right person at the right time. Now, Paul mentions some of the people who carried letters for him. For example, if you look in Ephesians 6:21, at the end of the letter, he mentions a certain person. We'll call him Tychicus or Tychicus, however you want to pronounce that. It says that Paul says that he sent this man to give news to the Christians in Ephesus, and that same person, Tychicus, is also mentioned in Colossians 4:7-9, where both he and certain Onesimus are promised to give news about Paul and his associates. So these people were the letter carriers, right? And they were also entrusted with the responsibility of kind of sharing some extra news because they saw Paul in person, and they could share a little bit more about Paul's life and what was going on in his life. So the letter carriers were very important people, and people that you could trust, right? So that trust was really important. And there are some other letters where Paul mentions the people that carry the letters along with them. But remember when I mentioned earlier that most letters were very short, right? In fact, if you look at the books of 2nd and 3rd John, if you take a few minutes, open up to those and read them, they're very short. I mean, it'll take you 2 minutes to read each one. They're very short, but those letters are very typical of letters in the ancient world. In fact, they look, and I have personally read through a number of these letters. And 2nd, 3rd John look very similar, right? You address the letter to somebody, you say your name, who you are sending it. You got usually a wish for health very often. Hope you're in good health. You share your bit of information or news and you close it out. And so 2nd and 3rd John are actually very, very much like most of these letters. Now, most of Paul's letters, on the other hand, and the other letters in the New Testament, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, Hebrews, all these other letters, they start off like any other letter, right? Addressing the letter to a person or a group of persons, stating who the letter is sent from, often with some greetings or a prayer, a wish for health, these types of things. But as you continue to read on in Paul's letters, they don't look very much like other standard letters. Because Paul goes on and on and on for a very long time. These are not short letters, right? This is not 2nd John or 3rd John. And Paul's letters, while he does exchange news, he extends greetings to certain people, his letters are really much more. There's much more to his letters. And we feel that when we read them, right? You feel God speaking to you. You feel, there's a certain depth to these words. Because really what I think we have in Paul's letters are his sermons. I think really what we have is Paul is preaching to these churches. He is speaking to them. He's giving God's message to them. He's exhorting them. He's encouraging them. He's referring to scriptures. He is really preaching in these letters, right? That's really what he's doing. That's really what's going on. Only because he couldn't be there in person, he's got to preach through these letters. And the letters, what they really were a substitute for his personal presence. Right? So when the person stands in front of them and reads the letter out loud, because they wouldn't take the letter and pass it around. They would gather the church together, gather these people together in somebody's house, and somebody would stand up and they would read it to them. Because remember, in the ancient world, it was probably no more than 10% of the population that could really read and write. So it would be one person speaking the letter out loud, and people would listen, and they would retain. They had, because they had to rely on their memory, I think generally speaking, people had better memory, could remember more of what was said. Another thing we need to briefly mention is that Paul would have used somebody called an amanuensis, right? An amanuensis, and I think this is mentioned in your textbook, was simply someone who wrote down a letter that was dictated to them, just a scribe, basically. So, for example, if you look at the end of Galatians, if you look in chapter 6, verse 11, Paul writes, "See with what large letters I write to you with my own hand." And he also says this at the end of Colossians and 2 Thessalonians. This is probably actually just a section of the letter where Paul took the pen up because he hadn't been the one writing the whole time. He takes the pen up and writes something in his own hand. And, since he says he writes in large letters, probably didn't have great handwriting. Okay? And he may have had some eye issues, some vision problems. So these sections at the end of these letters, Galatians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, Paul writes in his own hand. Then he hands the pen back to the amanuensis, the scribe, who continues to write what Paul is dictating to him. And I can just imagine, if you imagine yourself in the room with Paul, he might even be chained to a Roman soldier, right? He's in prison. But he's preaching away the letter to the Ephesians, right? He's preaching, and this amanuensis, the scribe, is just writing as fast as he can, trying to get everything down that Paul is saying, trying to keep up with Paul's words, trying to keep up with this great preacher. So, just to kind of give you a way to kind of enter into what the situation was like and kind of imagine yourself in the room while Paul is writing these letters. I think it's really interesting to kind of put ourselves there and just imagine what it would have been like while Paul was dictating these letters to these churches.